I thought she was just my boss, until she asked me to stay late. The office had that quiet hum of late morning productivity, keyboards clicking, phones occasionally ringing, and the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. I was at my desk, sorting through emails, when she appeared at the entrance. Even in the soft fluorescent light, she seemed to command the room effortlessly. She was in her early 40s, confident and poised, yet there was something approachable in the way her gaze briefly scanned the office before landing on her path to the conference room. Her hair, a subtle chestnut with streaks of silver, caught the light as she tucked a loose strand behind her ear. I noticed the small details: the elegant watch on her wrist, the way she carried herself with quiet authority, details that marked her not just as my boss, but as someone completely self-assured in her presence. Our eyes met for a moment across the open office space. I felt a strange mixture of admiration and hesitation, the kind that comes from recognizing someone's gravity before fully understanding them. Her lips curved slightly in what I imagined was a polite, professional acknowledgement, though it felt intimate somehow. I realized I was holding my breath for a fraction longer than usual. The world around us seemed to blur. The tapping of keyboards and muffled office chatter faded into background noise. It wasn't just attraction, it was the recognition of someone who seemed entirely in control, and yet entirely human. I returned to my work, but my attention kept drifting. She passed by again, this time stopping briefly at a colleague's desk. I watched the way her hand rested lightly on the edge of the desk, fingertips brushing papers with deliberate care. The motion was simple, almost incidental, yet it left a trace in my mind. There was grace in how she moved, but also a subtle warmth, the kind that made a professional interaction feel unexpectedly personal. I wondered what it would be like to sit across from her not just as an employee, but as someone who truly knew her. In those early moments, the office hierarchy was clear. She was the boss, older, experienced, untouchably composed. Yet, I couldn't ignore the fleeting glances, the micro-expressions that hinted at humor or contemplation, or the way her eyes seemed to notice things others overlooked. I found myself imagining scenarios where we could speak casually, where the distance between our ages and positions faded, replaced by something more human and immediate. Even as I tried to focus on the tasks at hand, the quiet pull of curiosity and subtle admiration lingered. The air felt heavier somehow, charged with potential. And though nothing had happened yet, I sensed that this ordinary workday held the possibility of something unusual, a connection that might grow quietly, deliberately, and beautifully, if I could navigate the delicate balance between professional respect and the inexplicable draw I felt toward her presence. The hum of the office had dimmed by mid-afternoon. Most of my colleagues had left, leaving only the faint glow of desk lamps and the soft murmur of the cleaning crew in the distance. I was focused on a spreadsheet when she appeared at my desk again. The sudden presence of someone so self-assured in the quiet office made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't easily explain. She leaned slightly over my workspace, her hand resting near mine on the edge of the desk, casual enough to seem professional, yet intimate enough to make me acutely aware of her warmth. "Could you stay late tonight?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying a subtle note that caught my attention. There was no coercion, no insistence, just an invitation that somehow felt charged with unspoken meaning. I blinked, momentarily distracted, my mind fumbling between the literal task and the weight of the gesture. Her eyes met mine, steady and observant, and I felt as though she could see into the part of me that wanted to say yes, even without fully understanding why. I nodded, a little too quickly, and she smiled, not a broad grin, but a small, knowing curve of her lips that made my stomach flutter. She explained the work to be done, pointing to documents and charts, but I noticed the way she lingered slightly closer than necessary. Her fingers brushed the back of my chair as she leaned to adjust a document, a fleeting contact that left a tingling warmth in its wake. It was brief, almost accidental, but in that simple touch, something unspoken passed between us, acknowledgement, curiosity, and perhaps a quiet challenge to my composure. The office felt different once she left. The air seemed heavier, more intimate, as if her presence had left an invisible trace. I returned to my work, but my focus kept breaking, my eyes flicking to the empty space where she had been. There was a subtle thrill in knowing that I would see her again later, in the quiet after hours, outside the usual rhythm of the office. The invitation felt like more than just extra work, it carried a sense of proximity, of private moments yet to unfold. As the evening drew closer, I found myself preemptively preparing, clearing my desk, arranging notes, wondering how the night would play out. The anticipation was tangible, almost electric. I imagined her walking back into the dim office, the soft click of her heels announcing her arrival, her silhouette outlined by the streetlight filtering through the window. And though I tried to convince myself this was purely professional, a part of me couldn't ignore the way my heart responded to her nearness, the unspoken potential in every glance and gesture. By the time she returned, the office felt like a small, secluded world of its own. We were alone, yet the air between us was charged with a quiet tension, a careful balance of respect, curiosity, and something more intimate. That single invitation, "Stay late tonight," had transformed a routine workplace into the beginning of something that promised to unfold slowly, delicately, and in a way that neither of us could ignore. The hum of the office had dimmed by mid-afternoon. Most of my colleagues had left, leaving only the faint glow of desk lamps and the soft murmur of the cleaning crew in the distance. I was focused on a spreadsheet when she appeared at my desk again. The sudden presence of someone so self-assured in the quiet office made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't easily explain. She leaned slightly over my workspace, her hand resting near mine on the edge of the desk, casual enough to seem professional, yet intimate enough to make me acutely aware of her warmth. "Could you stay late tonight?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying a subtle note that caught my attention. There was no coercion, no insistence, just an invitation that somehow felt charged with unspoken meaning. I blinked, momentarily distracted, my mind fumbling between the literal task and the weight of the gesture. Her eyes met mine, steady and observant, and I felt as though she could see into the part of me that wanted to say yes, even without fully understanding why. I nodded, a little too quickly, and she smiled, not a broad grin, but a small, knowing curve of her lips that made my stomach flutter. She explained the work to be done, pointing to documents and charts, but I noticed the way she lingered slightly closer than necessary. Her fingers brushed the back of my chair as she leaned to adjust a document, a fleeting contact that left a tingling warmth in its wake. It was brief, almost accidental, but in that simple touch, something unspoken passed between us, acknowledgement, curiosity, and perhaps a quiet challenge to my composure. The office felt different once she left. The air seemed heavier, more intimate, as if her presence had left an invisible trace. I returned to my work, but my focus kept breaking, my eyes flicking to the empty space where she had been. There was a subtle thrill in knowing that I would see her again later, in the quiet after hours, outside the usual rhythm of the office. The invitation felt like more than just extra work, it carried a sense of proximity, of private moments yet to unfold. As the evening drew closer, I found myself preemptively preparing, clearing my desk, arranging notes, wondering how the night would play out. The anticipation was tangible, almost electric. I imagined her walking back into the dim office, the soft click of her heels announcing her arrival, her silhouette outlined by the streetlight filtering through the window. And though I tried to convince myself this was purely professional, a part of me couldn't ignore the way my heart responded to her nearness, the unspoken potential in every glance and gesture. By the time she returned, the office felt like a small, secluded world of its own. We were alone, yet the air between us was charged with a quiet tension, a careful balance of respect, curiosity, and something more intimate. That single invitation, "Stay late tonight," had transformed a routine workplace into the beginning of something that promised to unfold slowly, delicately, and in a way that neither of us could ignore. The office had grown hushed, the hum of fluorescent lights blending with the soft tapping of keyboards. The rest of the building had emptied out, leaving only the two of us in the quiet. The air smelled faintly of coffee and paper, a comforting backdrop to the concentrated silence. I sat across from her, reviewing the spreadsheets she had asked me to organize, but I couldn't fully focus. Her presence seemed to expand the room, every subtle movement and breath suddenly amplified. She leaned over my desk to point out a detail, her hair falling gently forward, brushing against her shoulder. I noticed the delicate scent of her perfume, subtle, warm, slightly floral, and the way the light caught the soft highlights in her hair. My fingers brushed the edge of the paper as hers adjusted it, a fleeting contact that sent a small jolt through me. It was accidental, or perhaps deliberate, I couldn't tell, but the warmth of her hand lingered in my memory long after she pulled away. Our conversation was mostly professional, but the late-hour quiet gave it a strangely personal cadence. We exchanged small laughs over a misread chart, our voices low, intimate against the stillness of the office. The sound of her laughter, warm and sincere, seemed to vibrate through the space, making me hyper-aware of every movement she made. Even when we weren't speaking, there was a rhythm to the way we moved around each other, reaching for documents, sharing notes, adjusting chairs, that felt like an unspoken dance. At one point, our knees brushed under the desk. I froze, heart skipping a beat, while she glanced at me, her expression unreadable, almost amused. It was a touch so slight, so ordinary in any other context, but here it carried an electric intimacy, a reminder that we were alone together, removed from the structured confines of the office hours. There was trust in that space, a quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence without crossing the line into anything inappropriate. She sighed softly as she ran a hand through her hair while reviewing a particularly stubborn spreadsheet, and without thinking, I offered a tissue. Our hands met briefly as I passed it over, and I felt the warmth of her fingers against mine linger longer than expected. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile, and I realized the moment had carried more meaning than either of us had spoken aloud. The hours passed in this suspended quiet, punctuated by shared glances, soft laughter, and occasional brushings of hands. Every small gesture, the way she leaned closer to examine a report, the subtle adjustment of her chair next to mine, the warmth of her proximity, built a tension that was both exhilarating and comfortable. It was a closeness that neither of us had labeled yet, but it hummed quietly between us, promising the potential of something deeper. By the time the clock ticked toward evening, the office had become our secluded world, a space where professional boundaries blurred just enough to allow trust, curiosity, and a subtle, growing intimacy to take root. And as we worked side by side, the quiet rhythm of shared tasks and fleeting touches laid the foundation for the connection that was only just beginning to reveal itself. The office was quieter than ever now, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the blinds and casting long, soft shadows across the desks. The hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of papers were the only sounds. We had finished most of the work she asked me to stay late for, but neither of us seemed eager to leave. There was a pause in the task at hand, a gap that invited something more, a conversation beyond spreadsheets and deadlines. "I used to come here late like this all the time when I first started," she said softly, leaning back in her chair. Her eyes weren't on the screen, but on some distant memory. It was quieter, easier to think. There was a vulnerability in her voice that caught me off guard. The confident, composed woman I had admired all day was suddenly human, reflective, almost wistful. I felt a subtle tug in my chest, the first sense that she might share more than just work with me. I nodded, unsure what to say, and she smiled faintly, noticing my hesitation. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you ever like staying late, when everyone else has left?" Her tone was gentle, curious, inviting, not pressing. I shrugged lightly, realizing I didn't usually, but there was something different tonight, something in the calm space she created that made it feel safe. As we talked, I found myself noticing details I hadn't before, the slight crease near her eyes when she laughed, the soft inflection of her voice as she recounted a story from her younger days, the way her fingers traced the edge of the desk absent-mindedly. She spoke of family traditions, favorite books, little quirks from her past jobs. Each detail made her feel closer, more real, more approachable, not just my boss, but someone I might understand if given the chance. At one point, she paused mid-story, and her hand rested briefly on my shoulder as if to emphasize a point. The touch was light, fleeting, yet the warmth lingered in a way that made my stomach tighten. I felt a connection forming, subtle but undeniable, in the unspoken spaces between words and gestures. There was a rhythm to the conversation, punctuated by shared smiles, soft laughter, and quiet silences that were comfortable rather than awkward. The air around us seemed charged with a gentle intimacy. I was aware of her presence in a way that went beyond professional courtesy. Her nearness felt grounding, reassuring, and yet filled with a quiet thrill. Every small motion, every glance, every brush of hands seemed to speak in a language of trust and curiosity. By the time our conversation drifted back toward work, the office no longer felt like just a workplace. It had become a private haven where honesty, subtle connection, and unspoken emotions could breathe. That night, the boundary between professional and personal had shifted imperceptibly, leaving the promise of something deeper lingering in the air, a slow, quiet intimacy that neither of us fully named yet, but both of us felt. The office had taken on a different atmosphere by now, quiet except for the occasional shuffle of papers or the soft hum of the printer. We were both still seated at our desks, but the earlier ease of conversation had shifted slightly, replaced by a delicate, almost unspoken tension. I found myself more aware of her presence than ever, the subtle tilt of her head as she studied a chart, the faint crease between her brows when she concentrated, the way her hand brushed lightly against the edge of the desk. Each detail seemed amplified, charged with meaning I couldn't yet name. There was a sudden awareness of the age difference that had always been in the background. She was confident, graceful, and experienced, qualities that commanded attention and respect. I, on the other hand, felt younger, less seasoned, acutely conscious of the gap between us. It wasn't just the years. It was the difference in life experience, the unspoken knowledge that she had navigated complexities I had barely encountered. That awareness made every glance, every smile, and every fleeting touch feel heavier, more significant, and infinitely more complicated. We laughed softly over a minor mistake in the spreadsheet, our shoulders brushing under the desk. The contact was accidental, but my pulse betrayed the simplicity of the gesture. I caught her gaze briefly, and she held it just a moment longer than necessary, as if acknowledging something I hadn't dared to voice. A small smile flickered across her lips, subtle, knowing, and entirely private between us. That instant was electric, a reminder that the emotional tension between us was real, yet undefined. Her movements were careful, professional, but there was an undercurrent of softness, a vulnerability that didn't escape me. I noticed it when she paused, fingers lingering over a pen, seemingly lost in thought. I wanted to reach out, to offer some form of reassurance, but hesitated, acutely aware of the boundaries, both professional and social. And yet, the hesitation only heightened my awareness of her nearness, the warmth of her presence, and the unspoken pull between us. At one point, we simultaneously reached for the same document. Our hands brushed lightly, and we both paused. That fleeting touch, ordinary in any other context, felt like a bridge across the quiet chasm between admiration and desire. I realized that every small interaction, every unintentional contact, carried the weight of unspoken questions. What does this mean? Should I feel this? Could she feel it too? By the end of the night, as we wrapped up the work, the office felt both intimate and charged. The age gap was no longer just a background detail, it had become a lens through which every glance and gesture was filtered. Yet, the tension wasn't uncomfortable. It was thrilling, a careful balance of restraint and curiosity. That evening left us both acutely aware of the connection forming in silence, a slow, deliberate intimacy that neither of us could yet name, but neither could ignore. The office had grown even quieter now, the night settling around us like a soft blanket. Streetlights filtered through the blinds, casting long stripes across the desks and the scattered papers. We had finished most of the work, yet neither of us seemed ready to leave. There was a charged stillness in the room, a fragile tension that made every movement feel amplified. She reached for a pen that had rolled off her desk, and our hands brushed. The contact was fleeting, but it was enough to send a jolt of awareness through me. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the professional distance evaporated. I noticed the faint warmth of her fingers against mine, the gentle pulse in her wrist, the way her eyes held mine just a heartbeat longer than necessary. The air between us seemed to thrum with unspoken questions and quiet acknowledgement of the emotions we were both trying to hide. "Here," I said softly, handing her the pen. My voice sounded louder than intended in the silence. She accepted it, our fingers brushing again, this time a little longer. She gave a subtle, almost imperceptible smile, a smile that held gratitude, amusement, and something deeper I couldn't yet name. The gesture, simple as it was, felt intimate. It was the kind of connection that doesn't need words, a bridge built from small touches and mutual recognition. As we sat across from each other, the tension lingered, unspoken yet undeniable. Her hair fell forward slightly as she leaned over the paperwork, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume, warm, comforting, and oddly intoxicating in the quiet of the empty office. I wanted to reach out, to close the space between us, but I hesitated, aware of both the professional boundaries and the uncharted emotional territory we were treading. Every instinct urged me forward, every thought reminded me to stay composed. We shared a laugh over a minor mistake in the report, our eyes locking as the sound echoed softly in the empty room. That moment, so ordinary in words, felt extraordinary in presence. The subtle brushing of arms, the way our chairs had shifted closer without conscious thought, the warmth radiating from her proximity, all of it combined into a tension that was both thrilling and comforting. For a brief moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world, suspended in a delicate bubble of connection and anticipation. She sighed, running a hand through her hair as she leaned back. I offered a gentle, reassuring touch to her forearm, careful and deliberate. She looked up at me, eyes soft, and for a heartbeat, I imagined the possibility of confessing feelings I had barely allowed myself to acknowledge. But the words didn't come. Instead, we shared a quiet glance, a subtle acknowledgement that something had shifted, that the space between us was no longer just professional, and that the connection we had formed was real and mutual. By the time we finally stood to leave, the air was charged but tender. The office had become more than a workspace. It was a stage for trust, curiosity, and the beginnings of intimacy that neither of us fully named yet both felt. The night had brought us closer, leaving a delicate promise hanging in the air, that this connection, slow and deliberate, had only just begun to reveal itself. The office was nearly silent, save for the occasional click of a keyboard and the low hum of the air conditioning. The night outside had deepened, shadows stretching across the floor, and the work we had stayed late to complete was finally done. Yet neither of us moved immediately to leave. There was a quiet hesitation, a mutual awareness that the hours we had shared had changed something subtle but profound between us. She gathered her papers slowly, as if reluctant to end the moment. I watched the way her hands moved, deliberate, graceful, and the soft curve of her smile when our eyes met. For the first time that night, there was no pretense of professional distance. Our shared glances held warmth, curiosity, and a gentle recognition of the emotional bond that had quietly taken root. As she stood to leave, her hand brushed mine ever so lightly while collecting a stray document. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet I felt the warmth linger in a way that made my chest tighten with something more than work-related camaraderie. Her fingers lingered for just a moment, a subtle acknowledgement that the tension, the curiosity, and the quiet connection between us were mutual. That small touch spoke more than words ever could, affirming what had been building over the course of the evening, a silent promise of closeness and understanding. She paused at the door, coat in hand, and looked back at me. There was a softness in her gaze, a quiet invitation to continue this connection beyond the office walls, though either of us needed to speak it aloud. I noticed the warmth radiating from her presence, the faint fragrance of her perfume, the gentle lift of her chin as she gave a small, knowing smile. It was a moment suspended in time, tender and electric, where professional roles and age differences melted into irrelevance. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said finally, her voice low, calm, yet carrying an unspoken significance. The simplicity of the words contrasted with the depth of meaning they conveyed. I nodded, aware of the subtle weight behind them, and returned a smile that matched the quiet intensity in her eyes. It was a smile that acknowledged what had transpired between us, a connection grounded in respect, curiosity, and a slowly unfolding emotional intimacy. As she walked toward the elevator, I felt the lingering warmth of her presence, the echo of our shared laughter, and the unspoken understanding that this evening had marked the beginning of something delicate yet real. The office, once just a place of work, had become a space where trust, subtle affection, and emotional closeness had blossomed. By the time I finally left, the night felt transformed. The quiet streets outside mirrored the calm of the office, yet inside me there was a new awareness, a realization that this connection, slow and deliberate, had only just begun. The tension, the shared smiles, the fleeting touches, and the unspoken acknowledgement between us had created a foundation of intimacy and trust. And though nothing had been explicitly stated, both of us knew that this was only the beginning, a warm, patient unfolding of a bond that promised to grow in its own deliberate, beautiful way.